Next up is Kourtney Collum. Um, she is the Partridge Chair in Food and Sustainable Agriculture Systems and the Dean of the Faculty at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor. This is exactly what I'm saying. Why people who are this busy say, yes, I will talk on a Saturday night in front of a bunch of people. Kate, sign me up. I'm just so honored and thrilled that they do this. Even better, beginning on July 1st of this year, she will become the provost at College of the Atlantic. You didn't even know that was an applause line, did you? Kourtney grew up in Southeast Michigan and received a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology and Environmental Studies from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, right? And as an undergraduate, she interned on the trail crew at Baxter State Park and fell in love with the state of Maine, as all of us do the second we get here. She returned to earn a master's degree in forest resources and remained at UMaine, and in 2016 became the first person to graduate with a PhD from the college's then newly inaugurated Anthropology and Environmental Policy doctoral program. An applied environmental anthropologist, Kourtney has worked throughout Maine and maritime Canada on a number of projects that she will describe today, and her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Winter Gren Foundation, USDA Specialty Crop Research Initiative, Henry David Thoreau Foundation, and more. And I'm gonna quote the answer because I can't. It's just great. My favorite science-themed popular culture item is the podcast Ologies with Allie Warden, especially the short episodes for kids called Smologies. It's a great podcast if you haven't listened to it. I keep trying to get my 6-year-old son excited about the insect episodes, but he just wants to learn about saber-toothed tigers and cryptozoology. We've all been.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. Raise your hand if you've heard pollinators aren't doing very well. Yeah. Across the globe, we're seeing declines in the diversity and abundance of pollinators, like this beautiful orange-belted bumblebee right here. This is concerning not only because pollinators deserve to thrive simply for their own sake, but also a third of the crops that humans grow are completely dependent on insects for pollination. This is particularly concerning in places like Maine and maritime Canada, where we grow low-bush blueberries, one of those crops that's dependent on insects. So no pollination, no fruit set, no beautiful, ripe, juicy blueberries. Oh no. Okay. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. All kinds of bees do pollination, but for the low-bush blueberry industry, the most important one is the European honeybee. And that's because it's a eusocial insect. It lives in these massive colonies, which makes it possible for humans to manage them like livestock. And we transport them around the country from almond to blueberry to apple to perform the work of pollination. Wild bees are actually really important, and we don't talk about them enough. They're actually better pollinators than honeybees, much better pollinators, and they're experiencing the most significant declines. I began researching this question about a decade ago at the University of Maine as part of a big interdisciplinary research team. And my natural science colleagues were interested in understanding the factors that were affecting the health of bees. So they were doing things like measuring pesticide and viral loads. But I was really interested in human questions about farmers and their behavior. Questions like, in the face of declining bee populations, what factors influence farmers' willingness and ability to practice on-farm pollinator conservation? This is what social scientists do, right? So I traveled across Maine and Prince Edward Island. I interviewed more than 100 folks working with and in the blueberry industry. I engaged in participant observation, so actually learning to keep bees and working with growers. And we conducted a big industry-wide survey. And we learned a lot. And one of the things we learned, not surprisingly, is that farmers are super creative. They don't always do what cooperative extension tells them to do, right? So they were taking the recommendations of cooperative extension. They were doing things like planting bee-friendly bees or bee-friendly plants, but they also wanted to innovate. They wanted low-cost solutions. So they were doing things like mowing the perimeter of fields and allowing it to grow back in whatever wildflowers happen to be in the seedbed. And then they were doing their own monitoring to see what impact that had on bee populations and figuring out what they really needed to invest in. This research allowed us to identify the on-farm pollinator conservation practices that people were implementing and compare what people were doing in Maine compared to Prince Edward Island. And we found that they were doing all sorts of things, from passive strategies like leaving standing deadwood to provide nesting sites for bees, to more active strategies like altering the timing and frequency of pesticide applications. And really importantly, we were able to identify the factors that actually help farmers engage in bee conservation. Factors like their participation in farmer-to-farmer exchange networks, which we found really increased their adaptive capacity and resilience in the face of all the change they're facing right now. So I continue to do research with farmers and growers, but I also apply these same social science techniques to address other kinds of questions. My current project is on prison food systems. Prison food is notoriously bad. It's linked to all kinds of health and behavior impacts in carceral systems in the United States. And Maine has actually become a leader nationally for our approach to corrections. In the last decade, we've implemented garden programs in every single prison in the state of Maine, and we're looking at what impact that has on recidivism. So I'm now working with students at College of the Atlantic, and we're collecting data to try to understand, do these garden programs actually improve health outcomes for incarcerated people? And does that lead to reduced recidivism rates and support successful reentry into communities? I finished before the time. Thank you.
Any questions for Kourtney?
I think you touched on it a little bit, but so how does aerial herbicides like glyphosate affect bee populations?
Yeah, okay. Well, keep in mind, I am not an entomologist. I'm a social scientist. I will say a lot of the natural scientists I worked with, a challenge we would face is that we know organophosphates are not good for bees. The problem is we know that, we know neonicotinoids, which is that class of chemicals, is not good for bees. But before that, we were using a lot of organophosphates, and those were really bad for humans. So none of it's great. It's particularly bad for human health. And we know neonicotinoids are not good for bees. We also know it's a whole combination of stressors that's really impacting their health. It's loss of habitat, it's access to, pesticides, diseases, climate change, changes in phenology. So it's a pretty lethal cocktail that bees are experiencing.
How did you go about approaching the prison system to pitch this idea to them about the health and growing their own food?
So we didn't get them doing that. That's actually, Maine has a pretty awesome commissioner of corrections who worked in the prison. Actually, his father was an inmate in the prison, so he was working there while his father was incarcerated, and he saw the literature. He also saw the impact that poor food was having on folks. So they're doing it on their own, and now people are studying it to try to understand what impact that's having. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering if you can speak a little more about your experience with the peer-to-peer learning programs. Are these like programs that you've been involved in initiating, or groups that kind of existed within the community that you've learned from? I'm curious what your experience has been.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenge of the social sciences. We can identify what works well, but it's really hard to recreate that. You can't really create community for people and force them to be a part of it. It has to sort of happen organically. So yeah, we did identify ways we could support that. We were also able to identify places where, farmers used to meet in certain places and be able to chat, and now they're more isolated. There are fewer processors to go to. There are reasons why they're not interacting as much. But we found in the places where that interaction happens, they're stronger, they're more resilient. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Was that true regardless of whether it was Maine or PEI, and that both there were places where they met and collaborated, and that has pulled back as well?
The most interesting difference between Maine and PEI is that in Maine, we can access all of the honeybees we want to access. Because they're shipped all around the country, you know, the price is going up, they're becoming more expensive, but you can just rent them if you want to rent them. In Prince Edward Island, you couldn't do that. There was a ban that didn't allow bees to travel onto the island. So their farmers had to do on-farm conservation. And when I was there, they had removed that ban and they were starting to bring bees onto the island, but it was already a practice. Like farmers had already started to invest in on-farm bee conservation and diversify their sources of pollination. So it was an interesting case of a policy actually forcing them to do something that they didn't necessarily want to do, but then saw the value of.
So you mentioned that people manually transport bees. Are there any negative impacts to the ecosystem of manually transporting bees from one area to another?
Yeah, spread of disease for sure. The bees experience shipping fever, so you'll see them, they'll be coming soon. Like come April, look on the highway, you'll see the semis, they have these massive nets over them. It is stressful for the bees. You know, they do need to get out and defecate. They need to be cool. They need access to water. And one of those trucks always crashes every single year. You read it in the news. People get stung. So yeah. For that reason, we're trying to get more folks rearing honeybees locally. Yeah.
Thank you, Kourtney.
Thank you.